Okay, so we've been talking about the end times, and specifically we've spent time on the book of Daniel so far. These are what I've got on the screen right there for you now are the four views of the end times, three of them really being the Christian views, amillennial, premillennial, and postmillennial. And we've talked about the different ways in which these different views deal with these elements of the future, when the 70th week of Daniel or the tribulation takes place, when the millennial reign of Christ takes place, when the new heavens and earth will happen, when Christ returns, and when the resurrection will take place. And with the premillennial timeline, which is a position that we hold as a church, but that doesn't mean everyone in the church has to hold this position. But we believe that there is an unknown amount of time between right now and when the 70th week of Daniel, which coincides with that term, the tribulation, takes place. That is a 7-year period of time, at the end of which Christ will return and usher in the millennial reign, a 1,000-year reign on the earth. And then after that 1,000 years of Christ reigning on the earth, then he will create a new heaven and a new earth. The old heaven and the old earth will be dissolved, and we'll go on and living for eternity with God. And we also believe that the resurrection takes place along with Christ returning, but also partly before the tribulation, partly after. But that's a secondary thing. The premillennial timeline simply says that the tribulation takes place before Christ returns, and he returns before his millennial reign. Now, a postmillennial will say that Christ's reign is taking place now, and that he will return at the end of his reign on the earth, and then he'll create a new heaven and a new earth and reign in the new heaven and new earth physically. And so what they'll say is that right now he's reigning through us, through the church. We are the body of Christ, and in us he's reigning, which doesn't really seem to be the case if you look around, right? Again, but that's where they stand. And they say that the 70th week of Daniel, what we would call the 7-year tribulation, has already took place in the first century. The amillennial timeline says that the millennial reign of Christ is all figurative. It's him reigning in heaven, and that there will be a tribulation period. Maybe some say it's a few days, some say it's 3.5 years, some say it's 7 years. That's in the future, and right after that, Christ returns, and there's a new heaven and a new earth. But there's no 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth, right? So that is those are the three different views. And other than the pre-millennial position, the other views don't see the millennium as an actual 1,000 years. It's just 1,000 just means long time, and it just means long time. So those are your positions. Now we talked about Daniel chapter 2. We saw the image with the head of gold. And all of the different parts of the image, the chest, the thighs, the legs, the feet, were all different kingdoms, and the feet were destroyed by a rock, which was the kingdom of Christ. Then we saw in Daniel chapter 7, we saw again 4 kingdoms. The first one was like a lion this time, and was Babylon, the same as the head of gold in the other image. The second one was the bear, and that was Persia, and it coincided with the arms and the chest of silver. Then Greece was the third one, and this was a leopard in the vision in Daniel 7, but it coincided with the brass part, the joints and the thighs and the belly of brass. And then the Roman Empire coincided with the legs of iron in the other image. And this was out of the Roman Empire came a guy who's going to persecute believers. So we learned that from Daniel chapter 7. Now this Daniel chapter 8 dealt with the Greek kingdom that conquered the Medo-Persian Empire. And all of this you guys can go back and watch the videos on, when we're not going to try to go over everything every single time. Then out of the Greek Empire also came a guy who persecuted believers and caused the temple worship to stop. And he was a picture of the guy who's going to come out of the Roman Empire to do all of these things. Then in Daniel 9, we have that 70-week prophecy, which 69 of those weeks get us from the command to rebuild the temple all the way to when the Messiah is cut off. And that's 483 years, and it went from the time of Nehemiah in 444 BC all the way until 33 AD. Now, I think I might have misstated at some time as I was teaching. I may have, or I think multiple times, I may have said 30 AD. That was wrong. Okay, it's 33 AD when Christ entered into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. That's when those years bring us to, 33 AD. And probably to the exact day that Jesus entered into Jerusalem on the 10th of Nisan. But then there's 1 week left, and Daniel 9 talks about what happens in that last week. And each of these weeks are 7 years. You can go back and watch the video where I explain why we can prove that from the Scripture. But the last 7-year period is supposed to be, in the middle of it, there's supposed to be an abomination of desolation that causes all the sacrifices to stop in the temple. And the person who does this is supposed to do it in the middle of a 7-year peace treaty. He's supposed to be connected with the Roman Empire, and he's supposed to do this in a similar way to the way the Greek king did it hundreds of years before Christ. So, and the Greek king was Antiochus Epiphanes who did it. So, Daniel chapter 12, we have we talked a little bit about the exact days from the middle year of that week until when Jesus returns, until the end of that 70th week. And there's actually 1,335 days until the very end, 1,290 days until something else stops. And I suggest that that's probably when the persecution of the saints stops, 45 days before the very end. But again, you can go watch all the videos when I talk about that. We're going to move right along. So here's our summary conclusions, the things that we can learn from each chapter of Daniel about the end times. This is the part we didn't get to, so this is now a new territory here, okay? Okay, in chapter 2, we learned, these are the basic, without filling in any gaps, without me assuming that this means this and tying it in with some other prophecy, which we will have to do to kind of come to conclusions. But just from Daniel, we know that in chapter 2, Babylon was the head of gold, so Babylon was going to be followed by 3 empires before the kingdom of Christ came and is established by destroying part of that 3rd empire. Right? It was the feet of iron and clay with 10 toes. And it was when that empire was divided into 10 kings. Right? Or we're going to assume that it's 10 kings. But we know at least there's 3 empires, and Jesus is going to come after that to establish his kingdom. Christ's kingdom comes during a time of division and weakness of that final kingdom. And this final kingdom may be ruled by 10 kings. These are things we can gather from Daniel chapter 2. Because of the 10 toes, because it mentions those toes, and because it says the kingdom will be divided. Okay? Now, in Daniel chapter 7 and 8, we find out we're actually given the names of the next 2 kingdoms. Babylon is followed by Medo-Persia, which is then conquered by Greece. By the way, all of these things happened exactly the way Daniel predicted them. This is before the Persian Empire and before the Greek Empire. He's saying these things will happen. But then there was going to be that fourth kingdom, right? And we know that to be Rome, but this is what we know from chapter 7 and 8. We know that from chapter 7 and 8 that Christ's kingdom comes during the time of persecution of the saints in that 4th kingdom. And because in that 4th kingdom, there's going to be a guy who rises, he takes out 10 kings, all that stuff. The 4th kingdom will be ruled by 10 kings until one king rises to power, tearing down 3 others. And this great ruler will persecute the saints for 3.5 times. Okay? These are the things we know from this prophecy. Now, we're going to tie it all together here in a minute. These are just things we know from those prophecies. Okay? Daniel chapter 9, we learned that there's 70 weeks or 390 years remaining for all prophecy concerning Israel to be fulfilled. 69 of the weeks, or 483 years, beginning with the time of Nehemiah, will count down to the Messiah's arrival and his death. The city of Jerusalem and the temple will be destroyed after these 69 weeks, not necessarily at the end of the 69, just sometimes after the 69 weeks is done. And in the final week, which is 7 years, someone will make a covenant with many people and then will cause an abomination in the temple half of the way through. Then Daniel chapters 11 and 12, we find that the abomination of the Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes is a parallel of the end times abomination. This is pretty much spelled out for us in very great detail in Daniel chapter 11. Then, in the end time, there will be trouble like never was before. This is in Daniel chapter 12. And will never be after it. And it's connected to this abomination. And at this time, the wicked people will not be able to understand, but the saints will understand. Now, that's something we'll come back around to later. You can just kind of log that away for much later in the book of Revelation, but I think that's important to remember. And then there will be a period of 1,290 days after the abomination until something, and then something else that is good, happens 45 days later. Okay? These are what we know. Okay? You might say, oh, that's really confusing. Let me tie some of these things together. So chapter 2 and 7 and 8 tell us about these kingdoms. There's going to be during the fourth kingdom that all happens, meaning the Roman Empire. So now a post-millennialist is going to say, aha, see, Jesus had to come back during the Roman Empire. But you forget, Jesus didn't come back during the Roman Empire. Oh, we don't know, but see, he set up his church, and his church is now reigning in his place. But the Roman Empire was never split up into 10 kings. And one king never came and took out 3 of the non-existent 10 kings and started persecuting the saints for 3.5 years. None of that has happened. So there is a period of time left for this Roman Empire. You say, well, how could that be? That's we could speculate on that, right? It could come from the Roman Catholic Church. It could come from just something like the UN or NATO, or kind of reforms an empire like the Roman Empire, but it's split up. It's divided into 10 kings. We don't know. All we know is this is predicted, and when we see it happen, or when somebody sees it happen, they should be able to see, this is what God predicted. So this is something that hasn't happened yet, and it needs to happen. And during that time, there will be a king who rises, and he makes a covenant with, it seems like with Israel and with many other nations, like a peace in the Middle East treaty type of a thing. And in the middle, and he says it's going to be for 7 years, which is exactly the time that was predicted. And then in the middle of that, somewhere in that 4th year, he enters into the temple and causes an abomination that makes everything stop. And then he starts to persecute the saints for 3.5 times or years, right? So all of this, you can kind of tie it all together and say that's how much we know from Daniel, right? So you see there's a lot that we know from Daniel. Like a lot of the stuff that you look at and say, oh, I've heard this about the Antichrist and about the tribulation, about all this stuff. Oh, it must be in the book of Revelation. No. The book of Revelation gives a lot of details and a lot of things, but it's all tying into the basis and the foundation that we learn in Daniel. So anyone who tries to teach you about what's going to happen in the end times and never teaches about Daniel is probably going to end up leading you astray one way or another because they're not getting the foundation right. And so they're probably also having trouble. Okay, now we're going to talk about Matthew chapter 23. Now, some time ago when it would probably have been August or maybe September, I took the men's Sunday school class for a week that Brother Frank was out, and I taught on Matthew 24. Did I say 23? I meant 24. And I got done teaching, and I tried to go slow and careful, and everyone's just looking at me like, what was that? I have no idea what you just said. And I get it, because unless you really have a foundation in Daniel, you can't expect to really get a grasp on Matthew 24, because Matthew 24 is all talking about what Daniel said. But now that we've gone and done the hard work, the slow, methodic work of working through Daniel, now we should be able to go back to Matthew 24, and this should make a lot more sense. Okay? Let's start at the beginning. Verse number 1. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. Now this is the temple that was rebuilt, remember, and that was prophesied to Daniel that after the Messiah is cut off, a prince is going to come and he's going to destroy the temple, right? So remember, the temple's got to be destroyed after the Messiah comes, and then has to be somehow rebuilt before the middle of the tribulation of the 70th week, because then the temple sacrifice has to stop, which means there has to be a temple again. So we know that from Daniel 9. All right, so they're going out and looking at this temple that was built by during the time of Nehemiah, Ezra, all of them. And his disciples came forward to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? So the disciples hear Jesus predicting that the temple is going to be destroyed. And it will be, about 40 years from this point, actually 37 years, something like that. The temple is going to be destroyed. And this was actually predicted by Daniel. And but the disciples seem to misunderstand. Because when Jesus says the temple is going to be destroyed, remember, the disciples are expecting Jesus right now. They just heralded him as the king a few days ago at the triumphal entry. Now, Jesus is saying the temple is going to be destroyed. So what do the disciples think? Well, Jesus is coming, and when he comes to take control, he's going to destroy the temple. And so they say, okay, Lord, when is this going to happen? What is the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? What's the sign that you're going to come and destroy the temple and end the world, the end of all things? And of course, that wasn't going to be the end of the world. So Jesus answers this way. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. So I'm going to, before we get further into this, let me give you kind of an idea of what's being said here in each section. Matthew 24, we have verses 1 through 3 is the introduction. Right? This is the disciples asking Jesus about when the temple is destroyed, what's the sign of the temple being destroyed and of Jesus coming and of the end of the world. So they're associating the temple destruction with the end of the world. Then the next several verses 4 through 14, you're going to find Jesus giving them things that are not signs of the end. He says, you're mistaken. A war in Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple is not a sign of the end of the world. He says, Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many, and ye shall hear of wars and of rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. So one of the things that people say is, boy, looks like we're getting close to World War III right now in this world. And that's actually possible, right? That's a real possibility. But that doesn't mean that this is the end of the world, right? Jesus said you'll hear of wars, rumors. You know what they said when World War I happened? They said, aha, it's the end times. And guess what? That was over 100 years ago, right? What did they say when World War II happened? Aha, it's the end times. the Hitler is the Antichrist, which was a real, reasonable conclusion, right? But it wasn't, was it? And so Jesus is saying, listen, you misunderstand when I say that bad things are going to happen. You think, aha, the end of the world. And I'm just saying bad things happen. Wars, rumors of wars, they do happen. And these will happen at the end times, and they will happen before the end times, and they'll happen all the way in between, right? So, not signs of the end, okay? For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. He says, yeah, this is just the things that the world are going to be dealing with, the sorrows, or some would translate this birth pains. It is the same word used kind of like for the pains of childbirth. So this is just like the child isn't here yet, just because you're having pain, right? And, anyone who's given birth would probably know more than me, but there's pain all 9 months. Now, maybe there's more intense pain as you get closer, but there's just pain, right? And Jesus is saying, this is just the beginning. You're just wars and rumors of wars. Yeah, you're just somewhere in the beginning. You're not there yet. You're not at the end yet. So they're the beginning. And then by the way, the beginning, he's saying, is in 70 AD. So he's saying this is just a long process of time that was going to go on, and the destruction of the temple is just the beginning of a lot of things that are going to happen before the end. All right? Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall arise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. So these are just things. By the way, all these things happened in the first century. All these things happened a long time ago, and it's not the end of the world, right? The disciples were asking about the end of the world, and Jesus was saying, yeah, all these things are going to happen right pretty soon, actually. It's not going to be the end of the world. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. Now, this is a completely different question, but it's fair when you come across verses like this to put a question mark next to them and say, I don't understand that, right? Why is it that someone has to endure to the end to be saved? And I think it's because we exclusively use the word saved for salvation purposes, right? Excuse me, I just used it again, right? We exclusively use it for spiritual purposes, right? When we talk about being saved, we talk about being saved from the spiritual consequences for our sins, eternal death in hell, right? That's what we're talking about when we say saved. And the Bible often uses the word saved to talk about salvation from what we deserve for our sins and eternity in hell. However, the word saved can also mean, saving somebody from drowning. A lifeguard saved that person. Right? Those are all fair ways to use the word saved. And so what he's talking about here is, listen, you're going to live. If you make it through, you lived. Great, awesome, you made it. And some won't make it. There's going to be hard times, and some people are going to be put to death. Some people won't be put to death. And who's going to be put to death? Well, whoever gets through. There's not a promise that you're going to not be martyred for Christ here. Jesus is saying you might be. Yeah. You're not going to be necessarily rescued out of the trouble that you're going to face. And by the way, this is sometimes can be a problem with the premillennial view. Sometimes premillennial Christians like us, we look at the world that gets dark, we say, yes, God is going to get us out of here. But it's possible. Jesus is warning us here not to be just like, when bad things come, we're going to be rescued out of it. Understand that, he that endures to the end will be saved. Yeah. If you're there when Jesus returns, when at the rapture, which I would argue comes before the tribulation, yeah, great. But there's going to be lots of hard times in the world before then, and you might be killed for the name of Christ. And we know this because in our generation, people have been killed for the name of Christ. In Afghanistan, in the last several months, people have been killed for the name of Christ. So there's no promise that we're going to escape any tribulation. Now, here's what it says. He that endureth to the end shall be saved. Verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all the nations, and then shall the end come. So basically, he's saying all up until this point where he says, and then shall the end come. He's saying these are all things that are just going to happen, not connected with the end. They're just going to happen. All of these things are just going to happen between now and when the end stuff starts happening. None of them are signs of the end. So some people say, well, if we can just get the gospel to the whole world, then Jesus will come back. The gospel went to the whole known world in the time of the apostles. And we should continue to get the gospel out to places that we find are without gospel influence. And absolutely, but that's not going to bring the return of Christ, right? It's just, these are things that happen. So verse 4 through 14, things that are not signs of the end. That's what Jesus tells us. Then shall the end come, meaning these are not the end, or part of the end. But then, verse 15 through 35. And now he starts talking about the end. And you know this because he says, starts talking about the prophecy of Daniel. Because remember, Daniel said there were going to be those 69 weeks that led up to the cutting off of the Messiah. And then after that, the temple was going to be destroyed. And then sometime after that, that last week happened where the temple was all of a sudden back, right? So we know there had to be a gap between the 69th week and the 70th week. And so when the disciples are asking about the end, Jesus says none of the other stuff is really a sign of the end. But when you see what Daniel talked about, now you know you're in that 70th week, is what I'm reading between the lines, but here's what we're going to read here in verse 15. Jesus says, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet." Now remember, Daniel talked about two abominations of desolation. One was going to be in the Greek Empire, and that had already happened when Jesus came. So Jesus is in the Roman Empire, and he says there's going to be a coming abomination of desolation in the future. Just like Daniel had said, the first one was a picture of the second one. All right? When you shall see the abomination spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Now this is important. When you see it standing in the holy place. Now remember that Daniel's pretty explicit in chapter 11 that the abomination that Antiochus Epiphanes did, the Greek king, was going to be a picture of the abomination of the Roman, who we would call the Antichrist. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes actually set up an idol to Zeus in the temple of God, and he declared to everyone that he was God, that he was to be worshipped. Not just Zeus, but Antiochus Epiphanes. He actually even made coins that looked like Zeus and put his name on them, like he was Zeus, like he was God, right? So he actually set up a false idol in the temple and declared himself to be God, and then made the Jews eat swine and offered pig's blood on the altar and all those sort of things. So he says, when you see it stand in the holy place, meaning there's going to be a similar sort of a thing. There's going to be a worshiping of a false god forced in the temple, which, by the way, did not happen in 70 A.D. So the postmillennialist is going to say, hey, look, this happened in 70 A.D. The Romans came and they destroyed the temple. Yeah, but nobody ever stood in the temple declaring themselves to be God or set up an idol in the temple. None of that happened in 70 A.D. So this has not been fulfilled. Okay? He says, when you see this abomination of desolation, which is in the middle of that last week, remember, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe to them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in winter, neither on the Sabbath. Meaning this is a worldwide problem, right? Otherwise you'd have winter or the Sabbath all at the same time, right? You might be in the Sabbath in Israel, but in another part of the world, it's not the Sabbath. You're on a different day, because of, how time works, right? You might have winter or hard weather in one place of the world, and in another place of the world you wouldn't have winter or bad weather. And so this is suggesting then that he says, hope and pray that when you have to run, for you, it's not bad weather, or not winter, or it's not the Sabbath or whatever. He says, okay, pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath. Again, postmillennials will say this is all about just Israel. And there's no worldwide implication here. 21. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. Okay, so now Jesus is talking about things that are signs of the end. And he says, when you see that abomination that Daniel talked about, it's in the middle of that 7 years, then run. Get out of there, because there's going to be a persecution against you that has never been seen before and never will be seen again. Now, this is a direct quote of what Daniel said in Daniel chapter 12. Daniel prophesied that then Michael, the prince, will stand up for his people, and there will be trouble like has never been before and never will be again. This is Daniel chapter 12 that Jesus is quoting. And remember, when this guy sets up this abomination, he has 3.5 years to persecute the saints. And then he says, except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. Now, this is why I suggest that even though there's 1,335 days that Daniel gives us from the abomination until Jesus returns. You can find that in Daniel 12. The exact days. He says there's something else that stops 1,290 days after the abomination. And I think that's Jesus. Jesus said, except those days should be shortened. Meaning that before Jesus even returns, he sends something to stop this Antichrist man from continuing to persecute believers. And I'm going to suggest that it's the vial judgments in Revelation. But we'll get to that later, right? And I'll show you why. But you see how this is all tying together. He's talking about the abomination that Daniel talked about. He's talking about the great tribulation that Daniel 12 talks about. He's talking about the days being shortened, the exact days that Daniel actually gives you, the exact days. So Jesus here cannot be understood if you don't understand Daniel, because all he's doing is talking about what Daniel said and giving more insight into it. So here are things. So when he's asked, what's the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? He first says, let me clarify. All these things you think are the signs of the end of the world are not the signs of the end of the world. If you want a sign of the end of the world, look at the abomination of desolation that's promised by Daniel. That's the only sign you're going to get. Now, we haven't seen that yet. And if someone wants to argue that the sign was 70 AD, then why wasn't that the end of the world? And why didn't it fit any of the description of the sign? That's what postmillennialists will have to argue to say that all these things were fulfilled in the first century. 70 AD, King Titus of Rome did enter into Jerusalem and destroy the temple and destroy all of Jerusalem. But he didn't ever claim himself to be God. As a matter of fact, he never really went to the temple himself at all, and none of this took place the way that this abomination has to take place. How much time do we got? Because that clock isn't reliable. What are we looking at here? Okay, all right. We'll go 5 minutes and then we'll stop. Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not, for there shall arise false Christs and false prophets. And we're going to see this described for us in the book of Revelation, so make a mental note of this. There shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch if that it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Now remember what Daniel said? How the wicked will not understand, but the believers, the saints, the righteous will understand. And he says, there's going to be such deception after this abomination of desolation in that last 3.5 years that people are going to be deceived. It's going to be so bad that if it were possible, it would deceive even the elect, the believers, the saints. But it doesn't, but it would if it were possible. I'm going to protect them in a supernatural way. Otherwise, it's incredibly deceptive what takes place in those last 3.5 years. Okay, make a mental note of that, because we'll get to that when we get to the book of Revelation in much more detail. Okay, behold, I have told you before, wherefore, if they shall say unto you, behold, he is in the desert, go not forth, behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So he's saying, if someone says, Christ has returned, he's over here, come check it out, and it's probably just the agents of the Antichrist trying to put you to death, so don't do that. Don't go with them. And he says, listen, when I come, it's not going to be, he came in secret. No, I'm going to come like lightning. Everyone sees, it's in the sky, it's boom. You don't miss lightning, right? And if you don't see it, you hear the thunder, right? One way or another, you know what happened. Because that's the way I'm going to come. So don't worry about me accidentally coming and you accidentally miss it. Right? So as lightning, so shall be the coming of the Son of Man. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. He says, listen, there's going to be lots of dead people when I come back. There's going to be, I'm going to come back not as the lamb, but now as the lion. I'm going to come back conquering. And so you'll just follow the eagles to the carcasses and you'll find me. So the picture he's painting is pretty vivid. Now watch this. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, shall the sun be darkened. Now this is why I think what he's talking about here is the end of the 1,290 days, and then things get really, really bad as far as judgments being poured on the earth after The tribulation of those days. When he says tribulation, he's not talking about the 7-year tribulation that we like to refer to the 70th week of Daniel. He's talking about the days of tribulation of believers, the persecution of believers from the Antichrist after he commits the abomination, right? So when he says after the tribulation of those days, it caused me to think that the 1,290 days that Daniel mentions get us to the end of the tribulation of the saints. There's still 35 more days left before Jesus returns. And this 35 days, I think he's describing in verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, and from one end of heaven to the other. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the door. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. We'll close with this. When he talks about the fig tree here, he says, listen, just like when you see a fig tree and you see the colors that are in you know when the summer is coming, and you know what season you're in by looking at this fig tree. So when you see these things, now everyone wants to say, aha, the fig tree is Israel, and Israel's back in the land. So that means we're almost to the end. And that's not what Jesus said, is it? This is not at all what he said. He just said, just like when you see a fig tree, you can tell what season it is. In the same way, when you see these things, meaning the abomination of desolation and the sun turning dark and the persecution on belief, he's describing in order what happens from the middle point of that 7-year period on to the end. And he says, you see the abomination? Aha, Jesus is coming back pretty soon. We got about 3.5 years. Then 1,290, then he persecutes saints. Aha, Jesus is coming back really, really soon. 1,290 days later, the persecution of saints stops because the sun is darkened and the moon is as blood, and you can't really do much of anything on the earth. There's just complete turmoil and craziness. And aha, Jesus is coming back really, really soon. And Jesus is actually timing his return here. He's saying, listen, you can look at Daniel and find out exactly the day I'm coming based on the abomination of desolation. So if you're looking for sign of when I come, there you go. Go look at Daniel. He gives you the exact number of days, 1,335 days. So just know when you see that, I'm coming. Then, when we'll talk about this next week, he changes and he says, but wait, the day and hour of my coming, you're not going to know. Now, he's just explained how important it is that the disciples understand if they want to know when he's coming exactly to the day, they can look at the abomination of desolation. But, he says, of that day and hour, verse 36, knoweth no man. No, not the angels of heaven, but my Father. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So what he's saying now is when the abomination of desolation takes place, when all of these signs start happening, when that whole day and hour, that whole time period, that you're not going to know. That you're not going to know. It's going to come suddenly. And we're going to talk about that next week. So this is where we get the idea of what we call imminence. That is, Jesus can return at any moment. Now, Jesus' final return at the end of the 7-year tribulation, what we call the tribulation, right, is not imminent. It's not imminent. It's counted out exactly to the day from when the abomination takes place. Jesus says that the whole time period is imminent, that when it all starts, it's going to be like, boom, wow, what's happening? And people won't realize what's happening until they're in the middle of it. And he says that this time period starting, I'm giving you a little teaser for next week, this whole time period starting is characterized by 2 people being in a field, one gone, the other one left. The whole time period is characterized by 2 people being at work at the mill, and one of them's gone, the other one's left. And he calls that his coming as well. So he's talking not about two different comings, but he's talking about the whole time period of this seven years as his coming. Even though his actual return, like to the earth return, is at the end of it. The whole thing he's referring to as, that's my coming. That 7 years, you're going to see as tribulation, and people on the earth is going to see as all kinds of terrible. But for me, that 7 years is my 7-year coming. At the beginning of it, boom, it's going to be shocking. But at the end, you're going to know what's coming. And that's when Christ returns. Now, I've made a few statements here that haven't been substantiated by the text yet. So we're going to spend some time going through and showing why what I've just said, I think, holds up scrutiny and is proved by the text. But we're going to start getting into a little bit into the pre-tribulation rapture instead of just the premillennial coming of Christ. Those are two different things. So far, we've just kind of been showing how premillennial works, and postmillennial and amillennial really has to twist things to get there. We're going to get a little bit into the pre-tribulation rapture in the second half of Matthew 24, because I think that's what Jesus is telling us about. I really think that's what Matthew 24, verses 36 through 51 are all about. And I'm going to try to make that case next week. So that's it for this week. Any questions about that? I'm sure this is all very clear. You guys seem like you're tracking, and no questions at all on eschatology. You guys are like doctors in eschatology now, right? Any questions? That can't wait till next week. Okay, good. All right. Well, let's close, and we'll put all of this stuff online. We put the graphics online as well, just so that way people who are watching online get the same visual thing. And if there's something that I talk about that you say, man, I don't really understand that, I'd like to see that on the screen, let me know about it, and I'll put it together into a little slide, so it'll be easier to follow visually. So, all right, let's pray. Father, we thank you so much that you are coming, and one day, when we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. And though we don't know when that will happen, and I think it's dangerous when we start talking about how this event means Jesus is coming or that event means Jesus is coming. But we do know it could happen any moment, and we expect it to happen very soon. What a wonderful thing it would be if it took place before we got out the door this evening. Lord, we look forward to your return. We know it can happen anytime.